plate and let his eyes do the asking. 2 years since he had laughed out loud, though he still smiled, and the smile was real, and everyone in that house had learned to be grateful for it the way you're grateful for weather. 2 years, 7 months, and some days since he had said a single word to a single living soul, not from any hurt to his throat. The doctor in Baker City had checked that twice and found nothing at all wrong with the machinery. Owen Kirby could speak. He had simply decided, at 7 years old, standing wet on a riverbank with his mother already gone, that he never would again. It ended on an ordinary Tuesday at his own kitchen table, over nothing more dramatic than a dropped spoon, and the word, when it finally came, surprised every person who ever heard the story told afterward. It was not Papa. It was not Mama, though God knows the whole county had braced itself for that one, and dreaded it, and half expected it would break the boy in half if it ever came. It was the name of a woman who had been in that house 4 months. The new housekeeper. Nell. The Kirby place sat on good grazing land outside a small town in eastern Oregon, and Thaddeus Kirby ran it competently. The way a man runs something when running it is the only task left that doesn't require him to feel anything. He had a son. He loved that son with the particular ferocity of a man who has already lost one thing he could not survive losing twice. And he had, in his own house, organized every single day around a silence he could not bring himself to examine too closely, because examining it meant remembering the river, and remembering the river meant remembering the horse, and the horse meant remembering his own hands on the reins. Thaddeus Kirby had not said the word river out loud in 2 years either. Nobody in that county had ever noticed that his silence and his son's ran on exactly the same schedule. It happened in the spring of 1887, crossing the ford at high water after a wet season. In a wagon Thaddeus was driving himself. A rattler startled the horse at the worst possible second mid-current, and the wagon went over. Owen's mother, Susanna, went into the river. A hired man working the bank pulled Owen out 40 yards downstream, alive, cold, and shaking, and by the time anyone reached Susanna Kirby, it was already finished. Owen had not spoken since. The doctor called it shock, and said time would mend it. The way doctors said that about a great many things in 1887, whether or not it was strictly true. 2 years passed. Time had not mended it. What nobody in that house understood, because nobody had ever once asked the boy directly, gently, in a way he could safely answer, was that Owen's silence was not empty. It was full. He had a very specific, very wrong, very 7-year-old piece of arithmetic locked inside it, and he had been doing that some alone every day for 2 years, and it had never once occurred to a single adult around him that a child's silence might be holding an actual sentence rather than simply an absence of one. They treated it like a wound that needed quiet. It was closer to a debt he believed he owed and had no way to discuss. Thaddeus's answer to every well-meaning question from town, has the boy said anything yet, poor lamb, was always the same 6 words, delivered kindly and meant kindly. He'll talk when he's ready. It was true as far as it went. It was also, though Thaddeus could not have said so, a wall he had built to keep from having to find out what the boy might actually say if he did talk, because some part of him, the part that held those reins, was afraid of exactly the same conversation his son was afraid of. 2 people in one small house, each protecting the other from a truth neither one of them had. Nell Ferris came to keep house for them in February of 1889, hired through an agency in Portland. 28 years old, unmarried, and entirely unbothered by the warning the agency gave her about the boy. He won't speak. Don't force it. The families had trouble. Nell had a younger brother, back in Ohio, born deaf, and she had grown up in a house that talked around and past and straight through a silence, without ever once treating it like a tragedy that required careful handling. You simply spoke to Daniel. You watched his face. You found ways. Nobody had ever explained to Nell Ferris that a silent child was supposed to be handled like glass. So on her very first morning at the Kirby place, she did the one thing nobody in that county had thought to do in 2 years. She talked to Owen exactly like a person. Not about his mother. Not gently or carefully, or in the hushed register the whole town used around him. She asked him to pass the salt. She told him about the weather in Ohio. She complained, cheerfully, about a hen that had it in for her, and waited, out of habit, for him to laugh, which he did, silently, shoulders shaking, the first real reaction anyone had gotten out of him at that table in a year. She expected nothing back and treated that expectation as ordinary, which was a whole trick of it, though she never thought of it as a trick. It was simply how Daniel had taught her a person could be spoken to. The first sign came over porridge in her second week, entirely practical. She held up 2 fingers, then made a small closed fist and said, "That means yes if you'd like more. This," she opened the fist flat, "means no, you've had plenty, Daniel. And I made these up when he was small. Doesn't have to mean anything to anybody but us." She wasn't teaching him to be quiet better. She was giving him a way to answer that didn't cost him what speech seemed to cost him. Owen looked at her a long moment. Then he made the small fist. "Yes. The vocabulary grew the way such things do. Practical, unpretty, invented on the spot for whatever came up that week. More, stop, hurts, cold, tired, later. A dozen signs inside a month, none of them elegant, all of them adequate. And Owen used them constantly, at every meal in the yard, at his lessons. A boy suddenly capable of an enormous amount of ordinary conversation he had simply had no channel for. Thaddeus watched it happen with a complicated gratitude. His son was talking to Housekeeper, with his hands, but talking, correcting her, teasing her once with an exaggerated shrug that made her laugh out loud, in a way he had not managed with his own father in 2 years. Thaddeus told himself he was glad of it. He mostly was. Now, notice the other thing slowly. The way you notice a bruise is in a particular shape. Owen flinched every time, at any mention of water. Not fear exactly. A flinch, quick and controlled. Gone before you'd be sure you saw it, at rain at the horse trough, at a story someone told about a flooded creek 2 counties over. He was not simply silent about the accident. He was carrying it daily, in a very specific place. And Nell Ferris, who had grown up learning that a silence is not the same thing as an empty room, began to understand that whatever Owen Kirby was holding, it had a shape and a weight and probably a certain structure if he ever found a way to set it down. She gave him a slate in April for whatever the signs couldn't carry. He used it, at first, for nothing that mattered. Cully let the calf out. "I don't like turnips." The message came on a wet evening in May, after a whole day of rain that had made the boy quiet even for him. He sat at the table long after supper with the slate, writing slowly, crossing out twice, and finally pushed it across to her without looking up. Nell read it once, and then had to sit down. I told her jump. She didn't hear me fast enough. That's why. She looked at the boy across the table. 9 years old, chalk dust on his fingers, waiting with the particular stillness of a person who is just handed over the only thing he owns. "Owen," she said carefully, "did you shout it? At the river?" He nodded, and she didn't jump in time. Another nod. His eyes were very bright. "And you believe since then that if you'd shouted louder—" He didn't nod this time. He just looked at her, and that was answer enough. Nell did not correct him on the spot, because she did not yet know enough to correct him with, and a wrong reassurance would have been worse than none. "I'd like to ask Cully something," she said, "about that day. He was there. Would that be all right?" Owen went very still. Then, slowly, he made the small closed fist. Yes, it was, Nell understood, an enormous thing for him to allow. Permission to let another adult into the one fact he guarded alone for 2 years, and she did not treat it lightly. She found Cully in the barn the next morning, before anyone else was up. Cully was an old hand who'd worked that ranch 15 years and had never once, in 2, been asked directly what he saw. He told it plain, the way honest men do. The current had taken Susanna Kirby fast. Faster than anybody standing on that bank could account for. She'd gone under within seconds of the wagon going over, well before the boy's own head had cleared the water enough to shout anything at all. "He did holler," Cully said. "I heard it clear. So did Wilkins, standing right next to me. Boy shouted jump plain as day." He shook his head slowly. But it was already too late by then. Miss Ferris. She was gone under before that word left his mouth, near as I could reckon it. Nothing that boy hollered, loud or soft, was going to change what that water had already done. Nell stood in that barn a long moment, and then went to find Thaddeus. She told him plainly, because plainness was the only tool that had worked in that house yet. What Owen believed, what Cully had actually seen. The 2 years of arithmetic a 7-year-old had built out a single wrong assumption, and never once had corrected, because nobody had ever asked him what he was carrying. Thaddeus Kirby sat very still through the whole of it, and when she finished, he told her something he had never said to a living soul in 2 years. Not the doctor, not the preacher, not his own reflection. The horse spooked at a rattler, he said. I was driving. My hands were on the reins when it happened. He looked at his own hands. I've never once said the word river to that boy. I couldn't, because some part of me's been doing the same some he has, Miss Ferris, alone, for 2 years, wondering if a steadier hand on those lines would have kept us out of that current altogether. He'll talk when he's ready, Miss Ferris, Thaddeus said, and it came out smaller than he meant it to, worn thin from 2 years of use. That's all I've ever been able to give him. Nell looked at this tired, decent, guilt-carrying man across his own kitchen, and answered him as gently as she knew how. You've been waiting for him to be ready, she said. He's been waiting for someone to ask. Thaddeus Kirby put his head in his hands. And you've been carrying the same wrong some he has, Nell said, sitting 3 feet apart at that table every night. And neither one of you has said the word out loud in 2 years. You're not protecting him from it, Mr. Kirby. You're both just alone with it. Together. Sunday, Nell suggested a walk. She did not call it anything else, and did not come along. Thaddeus took his son down to the river, the same crossing, because there was no other, and a ranch needs its water regardless of what happened in it once. He said the word out loud for the first time in 2 years, standing on that bank. River, he said, plainly, and then, because he'd promised himself he'd get the whole of it or not start all, he told his son about the rattler and the reins, and his own 2 years of the identical silent sum, wondering whether steadier hands could have kept them out of that water altogether. Owen listened with his whole body, and then his father told him the thing Cully had said, in his own words, gently, looking at his son and not away from him. You shouted, Owen. 2 men heard it clear. She was already under by the time that word left you. There was nothing any voice on this earth could have done by then, loud or soft. You didn't fail her. There wasn't some to get right. There was only water faster than any of us. Owen Kirby did not speak at the river. That is worth saying plainly, because a story like this one likes to put the words in a boy's mouth right at the dramatic moment. And that is not how it happened, and Nell Ferris always insisted on the truth of it afterward. He cried hard, for the first time in 2 years, held against his father's chest on that riverbank, and neither of them said another word the whole walk home. But something had been set down that day that had been carried a long while, and a person does not stand back up from that in an instant. It took 4 more days. It happened on a Tuesday at the kitchen table, over a drop spoon. Nell was at the stove with her back turned, and Owen needed her, for nothing large. His milk had gone over, and he wanted a cloth, the kind of ordinary 5-second household need that fills 100 moments in any family's day. He made the sign for stop, then for help, quick, at a back that wasn't looking. She didn't see it. He tried again, and she was reaching for the coffee pot, half turned away, and 2 years of an adequate, invented, hand-built language ran up against one simple fact. Signs only work on someone who's looking, and just now, nobody was. Owen Kirby opened his mouth, and the thing that came out of it, after 2 years and 7 months of complete silence, was not a cry of alarm. It was her name. Nell. She turned around so fast she nearly dropped the pot. The kitchen went entirely still. Thaddeus half out his chair at the table, Nell frozen with the coffee halfway poured, the milk still spreading in a small white lake across the boards, utterly unimportant now. Owen looked as startled as anyone in the room. He put his own hand up to his mouth, the way you'd touch a place you'd just been burned, as if checking that the word had actually come from him. Say it again, Nell said very quietly, because she could not think of anything else in the world to say. Nell, said Owen Kirby, and then, because the milk really was everywhere, and because a boy who has just found his voice again still has to live in the kitchen, there's milk on the floor. It did not come all at once after that. It came slowly, over months. Single words first, then short sentences, full conversation by the following spring. Though he stayed a quiet boy his whole life, the kind who thinks before he uses a word rather than the kind who wastes them. His father cried harder that Tuesday than Owen had cried at the river, standing in his own kitchen with a wet cloth in his hand, thanking a housekeeper for something he could not begin to find words adequate to. He'll talk. When he's ready turned out to be true after all. It had simply needed to mean something other than wait. And don't ask and hope. It needed, in the end, to mean. Find out what he's carrying and set it down together and give him a hand to hold up while he does. Thaddeus Kirby married Nell Ferris the following autumn, and it surprised precisely nobody in that county, which had watched the whole slow business from a respectful distance the way small counties do. They kept the signs. That is a detail people always ask about afterward, and it is the truest one. Even once Owen could speak as much as any boy his age, the family never let the hand signs go. Taught them, in time, to a baby sister who came along 2 years later. Not because anyone in that house needed them any longer, but because a family that has once learned another way to be heard does not throw it away simply because the emergency has passed. There's a photograph somewhere of Owen Kirby at 14, sitting at that same kitchen table, patiently making the small closed fist for a toddler too young yet to manage the sign herself. Yes, it means. It has always meant yes. It was simply the first word that house ever learned to hear.